Hi there, Year 11. In this video, we're going to look at past ecosystems and particularly focus on past ecosystems in Australia and how they relate to megafauna. Now, I wanted to start by just briefly talking about dinosaurs and the idea of what dinosaurs look like and how that has changed and evolved as we've gathered more evidence from fossils and other forms of evidence. And we typically think of dinosaurs as looking like these two here on the screen at the moment, the Tyrannosaurus rex and the pterodactyl. And the idea that they were lizard-like reptilian-type creatures that were greatly adapted for hunting or eating vegetation, that they were giant, they were huge animals that used to roam the world, and fierce battles like we think about with Jurassic Park and those sorts of things as well. And it's interesting to think that this is what we think they look like when we also think that they're probably related to modern day birds, or at least modern day birds are descendants of these original dinosaurs. And as our fossil evidence has increased and we've gotten more fossil evidence, we've started to change a little bit what we think about when we think about what dinosaurs look like. And more modern theories of dinosaurs sort of indicate that perhaps dinosaurs looked a little bit more like this. And this is very different to that typical T-Rex lizard-like structure that we thought of, that we think the dinosaurs probably were covered in some sort of feather-like structure. And from that feather-like structure, the feathers of birds evolved, and that they sort of probably resembled a lot more closely to birds than what we at least originally thought, which puts a different idea in our head when we think of dinosaurs. Now, when it comes to evidence of past ecosystems, we need to think about how long ago things occurred. So how do we learn about our ancestors and how they lived 100 years ago? Well, we might have stories, we might have people that were still alive or still alive today that were alive then as well that can tell stories as well. We have evidence in terms of videos and photos, and although videos would be very primitive compared to today, written documentation. We've got, in other words, quite a bit of evidence of what was happening 100 years ago. But if we go back 200 years, and all of a sudden the evidence is not quite as strong. It's still very strong, but it's not quite as strong as the evidence we would have had for 100 years ago. Now we're relying more on photographs and the written word and those sorts of things to tell us what was happening back then. If we go back 1,000 years, and now we're really getting to the point where we're starting to look at fossils and these sorts of things and artifacts to really give a picture of what the ecosystems were like back then, whether that be pictures or art. Some books would have had some evidence of what was happening back then as well, but certainly not as strong as, say, something we would have had for 100 years ago. And then 10,000 years or more, and we're going to really struggle to have, obviously we'll have no pictures or video evidence of what was like back then, but we might have some writings, some art we can refer to, but more likely we're going to be relying on fossils and other evidence to clue us into what things were like back then. Now, the trouble with that is it is like our dinosaur example. It is based on the evidence we have and our interpretation of that evidence, and as more evidence comes to light, it might show that what we think now is actually not quite exactly correct. That thinking might evolve and change over time as we're presented with more evidence. Now, here's a question for you to consider. This is a video, one of the last known videos ever taken of the Tasmanian tiger, or also known as the thylacine. And the question is, did the thylacine ever live on mainland Australia? And if it did, how would we know? We certainly don't have any videos or photos of the thylacine living on mainland Australia. But we do have some fossil evidence to show that the thylacine probably did live on mainland Australia. And it comes in the form of Aboriginal rock art or historic art painted by Aboriginal people. And this documentation is equal to other artwork around the world or written documentation, that we can look at these caves and look at these really, really old paintings and use that to interpret what was likely happening or likely in the ecosystem at that time. Now, this is from those caves in Northern Territory, and you can see this distinctive line pattern that we see on the thylacine or the Tasmanian tiger. So this is an indication that perhaps Tasmanian tigers or thylacines were roaming the northern parts of Australia at that time. Now, it's highly unlikely that any Aboriginal people there came from Tasmania originally. Just the technology at the time would have been very difficult to traverse that amount of area. It's far more likely that they were just drawing the things they were seeing in their local ecosystem, which included at the time the thylacine. Now, this is another cave painting or rock painting from that same area, looking at the giant emu or the Geniormus. And this is an emu that lived about 40,000 years ago. So again, we're relying on the idea that Aboriginal people at the time were just drawing what they were seeing around them. And that can be a fairly strong, almost observational or first-hand report of what sort of organisms were existing in that area at the time. Another example here is the Palochestes, which is almost kind of like almost like a wombat type creature, but again, really large, what we call part of the megafauna family. These idea that we had these giant animals roaming around in Australia. And then we also have, for example, here the Thylacaleo, and this is not a thylacine, but it's similar to the thylacine. It's actually the Leo in the name might give you a clue as to what it is. It's actually a marsupial lion. And this is what we think the marsupial lions look like, and also roaming that same sort of area in Northern Territory. Now, these are all part of what we call the megafauna of Australia, and megafauna still exists today in forms of whales and elephants and giraffes, these really large animals that still exist today. But Australia used to have its own unique megafauna roaming pretty freely across Australia. We know this because of fossil records, and particularly because of those Aboriginal rock art that I was talking about before. But we don't have any of these organisms anymore. And so then that poses the question of where did they go? Why don't we have these organisms roaming around Australia like we used to? Now, there's two main theories as to what happened to these megafauna. And one of those is to do with changes in climate. Now, around the time that we think this megafauna started to go extinct was during a ice age. And an ice age essentially dried out the continent of Australia. It made a lot of the water that was available locked into ice, which meant it wasn't as readily available for consumption and not available for the flora and the vegetation either. So we know around that time, 40 to 60 and a little bit further years ago, 40 to 60,000 years ago, I should say, that rainforests started to diminish as well. And these have been replaced by eucalypt forests. And eucalypt forest is what we see pretty broadly across Australia in lots of different climate areas. Now, rainforests are really efficient at cycling and retaining water. The leaves give off a lot of water in transpiration. It creates this humid environment, this microenvironment that allows for a lot of rain. And that's where that rainforest name comes from. But the eucalypt forests are not as efficient at this water recycling process. And so if they're not as efficient at releasing water to the atmosphere, it means there's going to be less water around, which is going to lead to hotter and drier forest and hotter and drier climate, which then in turn will lead to more fires. And the idea here of the changing in climate is that the animals that are able to survive the droughts and the fires became the fittest species. So they're the ones that survived that survival or the battle of the survival of the fittest rather. And so they're the types of animals that we see today, or the types of organisms that we see today. And the idea is that these larger organisms, these megafauna, weren't able to survive these droughts and fires. They had a lot more demand for water to be able to survive. And being big, sort of slow-moving animals meant that when there were fires, they weren't able to escape them as well as they otherwise would. Now, there's some arguments for and against this theory. It is a theory, and as such, there are arguments for and against. But one argument for the idea of this climate impact on our megafauna is the idea that there was less water to support the megafauna. If there's less water available in the environment, those large animals that need a lot more water are not going to have access to that water as readily. And then the idea there is those megafauna are unable to adapt to temperature changes. Less water, less food, drying out, all those sorts of things that impacted on the way these megafauna survived and lived. And so that's one of the arguments for the idea that climate change, or climate changing at the time, led to the extinction of the megafauna. But there are also arguments against that idea, and one of the main ones is that we've had lots of ice ages before, and this ice age, the most recent one, probably wasn't any different to the ones before. But that then raises the idea that why did this particular ice age have such a large impact? We know that megafauna survived through ice ages before, but what was it about this one in Australia that ended the majority of our available megafauna? There's also the idea that earlier extinctions seem to occur before the peak of the ice age. So some of the megafauna where we have fossil evidence that they ceased to exist at a certain time, and we can date that with some relative accuracy, there's the idea that those extinctions seem to occur before the ice age reached its peak. So that makes it a difficult argument then to say that climate change, or the climate at the time, probably made a big difference. And we also know that climate change today is not necessarily selecting against slower and larger organisms. That we still see elephants and giraffes, and in the ocean we see some of the large animals there as well. That the climate change today is not selecting against those animals. So why would it be that, again, that particular ice age at that time did select against all these animals? Which leads us to the second theory of why the megafauna disappeared, and that's the idea that it coincides with the arrival of humans into Australia. So Aboriginal people arrived in Australia about 65,000 years ago, and they were incredibly successful hunters. They used processes like fire stick farming to help improve vegetation and regenerate vegetation. And just like our talk before about competitions and predator-prey, if there's more food around, that's going to lead to more animals. And this is what Aboriginal people wanted, because it meant there was more animals then for them to hunt and be able to eat themselves. Now, evidence suggests that humans hunted megafauna as they were mega slow. They're big animals, they had short limbs, they weren't able to be as agile and free-moving as, say, our modern-day kangaroos or even our wombats, and therefore they were easier to hunt and easier to bring down. There's also the idea that dingoes that were introduced around about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, that they may have outcompeted the thylacine and the Tassie devil on the Australian mainland and helped bring about the extinction of those two organisms from the Australian mainland. Now again, this is just a theory, the human hypothesis as we call it, and there's arguments supporting the human hypothesis, there's arguments against the human hypothesis as well. So some of those arguments supporting it is the idea that there's evidence of increasing fires because we see increasing carbon deposits in the fossils from about 40,000 years ago. So the idea here is the increasing fires were a direct result of Aboriginal people using farming methods like fire stick farming to increase the amount of fires and make them more regulated so that they could increase that vegetative growth as it regenerates. There's also the idea, again, that the megafauna had short limbs and they were slow moving, making them easy targets for hunting. But the surviving megafauna, like the red kangaroo, for example, which would just be classified as megafauna, are quite agile and fast moving. So the idea here is that the megafauna that did go extinct were those that were the slow moving megafauna, but those megafauna that were fast and more agile were able to escape the fires and escape the hunters, and they still exist to today. And then some of the arguments against the idea that humans brought about the extinction of the megafauna is two key ones. One is that there's just no fossil evidence of kill sites like we'd expect if megafauna were hunted to extinction. And there's also really not a lot of evidence that humans and megafauna coexisted, at least not in the fossil record or anything sort of that we can conclusively say that there was proof that they existed together. So they're two theories of what happened to Australia's megafauna. It's important to understand both theories and arguments for and against, and to realise that in this case it is really just a theory, that we're starting to look at the fossil evidence and trying to piece together all the pictures from the information we have to explain what was happening back then and hopefully explain what happened to the megafauna.